Good afternoon and hello, everyone. My name is Rich Longo of Flycast Partners, and I want to thank you for joining us for today's presentation on Protect Your Number One Threat Vector provided by Brian Reed of Proofpoint. Now, Brian has well over 20 plus years in IT security experience and has worked in a variety of product development, product management, systems engineering, business development, and sales roles. He's had specialties in security and solution selling and team selling and technical sales. He's been involved with Gartner for the last several years and comes to Proofpoint from Gartner. Before we get started, Brian, let me introduce Flycast Partners. Flycast Partners offers best-in-class implementation services and training in IT service management, IT asset management, IT operations management, IT security, enterprise service management, and workload automation spaces, all using ITIL best practice. Our professional services team has well over 5,500 professional service engagements, both on-site and remote. That's correct, on remote, especially this year. As an organization, we have well over 1,200 regular customers throughout Canada and the United States. And I encourage you to reach out to us at 844-FLYCAST. That's 844-359-2278, or visit our website. As you can see, we have launched a new website, folks. This website is tailored just for you. You can easily locate any topic that you may be looking for, whether it be different problems you might be experiencing in IT that we might be able to assist you with, or training, or upcoming events, or other resources for data sheets and white papers. So please take the time to go peruse around our website and see what we have there. I also encourage you to email us at info@flycastpartners.com. Should you have any questions, that's email us at info@flycastpartners.com. So without further delay, I'm going to go ahead and try to transfer this over to Mr. Brian Reed. It's all yours.
All right. Thanks, Rich. Thanks again for having me. Super excited to talk about protecting your number one threat vector and stopping the next wave of email threats. So again, I'm Brian Reed with Proofpoint, and let's go ahead and get started, Rich. So a lot of these stats and metrics and things like this over the last couple of years, there's a number of headlines around business email compromise and email account compromise from 2019, 2020. We'll get into some of the differences in what BEC and EAC actually mean here in a moment. But BEC and EAC don't just happen in the public sector, but this is prolific in the private sector. There's all sorts of news headlines from even recently in the past couple of months. And according to the FBI CSI report, BEC and EAC has cost victimized businesses over $26 billion since middle of 2016. So if we look at the next slide, business email compromise and email account compromise are actually becoming the CISO's top concern. So if we look at the next slide here, Rich, and look at this $26.2 billion number plus that the FBI has actually had a running total on for almost the last 4.5, working on 5 years here in June. BEC is really a new form of email threat that's become really that top concern, not just for CISOs, but this is a board level concern because it causes significant financial losses. The average BEC attack nets the attacker around $130,000. So this is a problem large and small and far and wide. And in 2019, BEC attacks have increased almost 100%. Nearly 90% of organizations have experienced some form of BEC and spear phishing. And really, this is a universal problem. I know we've got a reference here to the State of the Phish report from 2019. Proofpoint just recently came out with our 2020 report, and that's available at proofpoint.com. And even our friends at Gartner predict that BEC will continue to double each year to over $5 billion annually through 2023. So the problem's clearly growing. It's not going away. And Gartner analysts suggest that security and risk management leaders should ensure they have technologies and processes in place to protect against BEC attacks. It's not simply enough to just go buy technology to solve the problem. BEC really takes advantage of the process breakdowns and business process breakdowns that you have in your environment. So if BEC really hasn't been a top priority for your organization, it really should be in the future. And it's something to very strongly consider doing something about immediately. So on the next slide, we're going to show how big this problem is with some more data points that we gathered here at Proofpoint. So at Proofpoint, we blocked about 15,000 BEC messages a day on average. And that basically works out, if you do the calendar math, to around 5 million business email compromise scams a year. So these BEC and email account compromise scams really aren't targeting everyone. They're targeting very specific people. So for instance, executive impersonation has been a huge problem. People trying to impersonate or spoof your CEO. And on average, any given CEO or business leader is spoofed 102 times a quarter. I mean, that's pretty compelling when you talk about that sort of level of people trying to scam your business. So at Proofpoint, when we talk to our customers, they've absolutely confirmed that business email compromise, email account compromise scams have become one of their top concerns. So let's jump to the next slide and talk about email fraud and these two main threats. So email fraud really leads to the first threat being business email compromise, so BEC. What do we mean by that? So business email compromise, simply put, is when an attacker pretends to be you. They are trying to fool the world and have them think that they are in fact you. And the other one is email account compromise, if we build out the other side of this triangle, when the attacker actually becomes you. So what's interesting here is BEC, they're pretending, and email account compromise is the actual fact where they take over your account and truly, for all intents and purposes, become you. But the reality is that BEC and EAC are so intertwined that the FBI really, with their metrics, they're tracking both of these issues as a singular issue, as a single scam and crime type. What they have in common is that they target people. So the last session we did with Flycast, we talked about PeopleCentric Security, but they truly rely on social engineering. They're designed to try to solicit fraudulent wire transfers or some sort of business reaction. So what's BEC? BEC starts with an email where attackers poses someone the victim trusts. Then they make a legitimate business request, usually requesting some sort of sensitive information or a wire transfer of funds. BEC is hard to recognize because to the target, the request seems so routine. This might be part of normal business operations. Routinely, your CEO might ask your CFO or your head of sales or marketing to wire money. Might not seem anything out of the ordinary. It's also, from a technology standpoint, really hard to detect because there's no malicious payload, there's no malware, there's no URLs or URLs that are rewritten or any sort of attachments. This is strictly text of an email in most cases trying to solicit some sort of business response. So the common BEC tactics that we've seen are shown here on the slide, and they really include domain spoofing, which domain spoofing is a case where attackers hijack your domain itself to send fraudulent emails to your employees, your trusted business partners, your customers and clients, including your own company brand name, to try to show and prove and verify they are in fact you and they're asking for something legitimate. And without you having proper controls in place, domain spoofing can result in anyone using your trusted domain to send messages to anybody they want to. Display name spoofing is a little bit different. This is when attackers use the name of the spoofed executive, like your CEO, your CFO, your head of sales in the front field. But the email address actually comes from an outside service, a lot of times a webmail service like a Gmail or something like that belongs to the attacker. Now, the last case, lookalike domains, are really interesting because what attackers will do is they'll register a domain that looks very similar to your trusted, legitimate domain. So for instance, if your business title has a lowercase L in the title, they might substitute it for a number 1, or they might substitute an O, a lowercase letter O for a 0 or something like that. So if you don't pay close attention to that lookalike domain, you could potentially be sending your information somewhere else. So we've talked about business email compromise. Let's talk about what email account compromise is. So if we go to the next slide, in the case of email account compromise, remember, attackers utilize a variety of techniques where they actually become you. And some of these techniques might be password spraying, phishing, malware, some way to compromise the victim's email accounts. So one of the most common attack tactics we've seen is using things like brute force attacks, where attackers will use automated tools to try username and passwords over and over again. Another common method here is to look for reused credentials. So for instance, looking at well-known password dumps and things like that, or well-known breaches that have happened. The LinkedIn breach, Twitter, some of those places where people might use those same credentials for social media accounts that might have been compromised, or other legitimate businesses that have been compromised that they're using for their email accounts. The other big problem here is if you don't have multi-factor authentication enabled, stop what you're doing and go turn on multi-factor authentication. It's another safeguard in place to help that email account compromise from happening. But once attackers gain access to your legitimate mailbox, attackers can then access all your information. They're into your email, they're into your calendars, they're into your meetings, they're into your contacts with your suppliers and customers. They're going through and looking through your Active Directory and your corporate directory and harvesting contacts and even looking at files in your file shares. So attackers are really using all of this information to help build a victim profile so that they can closely monitor that victimized account and they can study the business. They'll mimic the victim. They'll craft even a lot of times convincing emails that might look like that person. So trying to use the same sort of vernacular and language and lingo, even picking up some of the business-specific acronyms that you have in your environment. So on the next slide, some common BEC and EAC attack types we see. There's a number of different attacks that could take place. So gift carding is one that you've probably seen, things like the fake Amazon gift cards out there, fake executives sending emails to an employee. Hey, it's Christmas time. I'm going to send everybody a $50 Starbucks card. Funny story. We actually did that internally here, and my boss had to tell people, hey, you're going to be seeing an email from Starbucks at this point in time. Definitely use your common sense, scrutinize it, but it is in fact a legitimate email. So if you do participate in things like gift carding programs, you have to over communicate to your employees, because a lot of people might send that to the spam filter just to try to be overly diligent. Payroll diversions, an attempt to defraud companies by manipulating a user to modify their own payroll system. So again, this is a form of business email compromise where you might be impersonating somebody else, that person's manager, that person's second level manager, an executive, and getting them to manipulate payroll information. Supplier invoicing fraud's a very sophisticated attack type where attackers impersonate a vendor. They gain access to an email account of that vendor and might pose as that vendor and try to send fake invoices to get paid upon and get found out. So there was a report that the FBI did where they profiled 9 companies that fell under business email compromise, and 2 of those 9 actually had losses of $100 million and up, just simply due to invoicing fraud. So this is one that can, the trick here is that you only have to be right once and only have to get paid once, and trying to get paid back on that fake invoice is a hard thing to do. There was also something here recently in the news in February of 2021 here that there was a case where there was a 9-figure payout that a judge actually ruled for some reason, jurisdictional or something, that they couldn't get that transaction back. So supplier invoicing fraud is a huge source of BEC losses. Merger and acquisition fraud is another one. And I would also add that merger, acquisition, and divestiture would be one of those scenarios where somebody goes in, tries to defraud a company, they're posing as somebody. A lot of times in order to complete an acquisition, you might need to send funds to a lawyer, funds to a broker, some sort of person that's controlling that business transaction of either buying a company or divesting part of a company to another entity. And they might pose as a law firm, they might pose as a closing house or something like that. And again, very real source of fraud. Shipment redirection is really a rerouting based attack where the fraudsters intercept a purchase confirmation email, then they reach out and contact the merchant, and they'll go in and try to redirect shipping or logistics information. So the next slide, digging into the way that we frame up the problem space, you can either be an employee or a supplier here on the vertical axis. And then across the bottom, if you build this out, you can either be a real you or a fake you. So you can be a business email compromise or an email account compromise case. And in the gift carding examples or the payroll diversion examples we just walked through, those would be in those top two quadrants up top. So in the bottom two quadrants, supplier impersonation and supplier account compromise, typically you need to have both of those have to come together to launch a successful attack. So yeah, if we build out the fake you versus the real you, next click here on the slide, yep. And we'll actually, you can triangulate what type of issue you might have. So looking further, the Supplier Focus BEC, as I mentioned, this is potentially where this is the high value sorts of problems. This often accounts for the biggest financial losses. These can go into the 7, 8, and even sometimes 9-figure cases globally. And it leverages both impersonation and account compromise, sometimes at the same time and jointly in the same attack. So if an attacker compromises an account of your supplier through brute force, they can look through that person's inbox. They can, do some reconnaissance and some logistical searching, and then find somebody who's communicating with their accounts payable department, and they have a thread talking about invoices and trying to sort out payment over unencrypted email. Easy way to then jump in the middle of that and sort of hijack that email thread, hijack that email conversation, and voila, you have Supplier Focus BEC. Organizations don't always have that kind of visibility in their supplier chain. You might not be using a secured web portal or a secured communication to manage supplier relationships or vendor relationship management. If you're a small or mid-sized business and you're doing all this through unencrypted email, that's potentially an issue where BEC could really crop up and bite you. All right, so next slide, 2 common supplier invoice tactics. These two are really best summed up as the first one really being around this thread hijacking, what I just mentioned of compromising an account that communicates with a target that has some sort of financial role, really hijacking that email thread, jumping in the middle and sort of injecting yourself into the discussion to reroute payments, lure the target into replying and repaying in a different way. And then the next side of this equation, the other common supplier invoicing tactics is around impersonation. So it's that supplier domain lookalike, getting somebody to go to a domain that looks very similar to that supplier, having something very public facing that might look very similar to the interface that you're already using. And that might be a way to lure somebody in. All right, so the next slide, we're going to talk about threat actors shifting around some of the security measures. And really what's going on here is the reason why these BEC and EAC issues are so complex and difficult to prevent is because attackers shift around the security measures they use. They don't just work on one way to get in your organization. They're not just hammering on your firewalls or looking for some piece of malware that your AV engine doesn't detect and building custom malware. They're looking at a number of different, they're triangulating a number of different ways to get in. So attackers will figure out who they want to go after and how to get them. And we better believe if they can find out their target's corporate email, they can also figure out their personal web email. There's a lot of services online that, particularly for your executive management team, it's a Google search away from being able to find every personal webmail account, every social media account that your executives have. So they're going to try coming in through cloud apps as well, whether through brute force attack or phishing attempts. They're going to come in through the web, like I mentioned, supplier risk and supply chain, and use your business partner's domain, or they're going to try to just go in through some other means possible. But the idea here is they're going to try multiple routes to success. And there's really no silver bullet for business email compromise. And you start to realize that when you put all these things together, and it's not just about stopping people from clicking links in an email, and it's not just about stopping people from running malware, you start to understand why this is a $26 billion plus program, problem and running. It's complex, it's multifaceted. You can't just buy a single product or technology, throw it in, dust your hands off, and be done. to really solve the problem comprehensively, you need a gateway and email authentication that can address business email compromise or those attacks that use a lot of those identity deception tactics. If you address those, the attackers are then going to move to account compromise. So you need to protect your cloud apps, and you should probably isolate the web access of your very attacked people. We talked about VEPs in the last session so that their credentials don't get phished. Now, as we build this out, you're also going to need visibility. If you build it out one more time, you're going to need visibility down here in the bottom right to what users are being attacked with imposter threats, as well as the emails being sent using your domain. Moreover, you want to be able to automate some of this remediation process, such as potential imposter email quarantining, password resets, or compromised account suspension. So you can have some alerts go off that might give you some clues around containing the spread of this kind of threat. So if we build this out and look at the remediation side here, let's not forget that these types of threats are targeting people directly. So one big way around this is really education. So if we build this out one more time, education is really at the core of this, because I mentioned a lot of times it's not about stopping people from clicking on a link. It's not about stopping people from going to a site. It's about having people use some of the cognitive skills and be able to realize that, hey, wait a minute, something about this doesn't sound right. I'm usually supposed to go to this website to make a payment or follow this process or call this number. I'm being asked to call a different number now. Something doesn't look right. One of the easy ways, particularly around some of the invoice fraud, is to make sure that there's a multi-step approval to paying invoices in your organizations. If you just have a single point of approval, a lot of times that's a problem that you can remedy with some process, along with some really good technology to help support you there. So let's talk about Proofpoint for a minute on the next slide. So how does Proofpoint do it uniquely and better? Well, next slide here, we're going to prevent some of that imposter and phishing threat effectively. We're going to detect and block imposter and phishing emails. We have a set of imposter classifiers that dynamically classify these forms of email threats. A big part of this is we're going to look at domain spoofing and fraudulent use of your trusted domain using things like DMARC authentication. So making sure that domain is in fact the domain it says it's coming from. Also protecting against some common business email compromise tactics like domain spoofing, display name spoofing, and those lookalike domains out there. And then finally, securing your brand reputation by protecting your customers and your business partners. So, digging into each one of these. So stopping BEC, this should actually say BEC and not BED, but a little typo on the slide there, with imposter classifier. So we're going to do this a couple of different ways. We're going to utilize machine learning to detect and block some of the more sophisticated attacks that come in. A lot of our competitors still rely on this antiquated and silo-based approach instead of this integrated approach. By using this integrated approach to looking for imposter-based attacks, a change in one element doesn't necessarily affect any of the others, and therefore the overall scoring is going to be slower to respond to changes. But what can happen in the siloed approach is if there's a big delay, it can allow threats to go undetected for some time until the analysis catches up. So Proofpoint has something that we call SCSS. That's our stateful composite scoring service. And it's our imposter classifier is contained in here. We leverage ML to analyze the emails, not just the content of what's in the email and the attachments, but also the context. We're looking at the language and verbiage of what's being said in there. And we're developing a baseline by learning how the organization's normal communication flow works. And we're aggregating that as well against what other organizations might look like when they have communications about paying invoices, for instance, or working with suppliers. So having this baseline allows the system to quickly spot and block emails that fall outside of the norm. And it really helps to increase effectiveness. And the imposter classifier doesn't rely on updates or training to be accurate. Instead, it's learning in real time. So a great way to think about this is like a brain that's constantly focused on trying to pick out imposters, picking out in people that might be quick changes in your threat landscape or might be acting in a different or anomalous way. Additionally, because the imposter attacks could be low prevalence, so these aren't necessarily the really noisy things. These aren't broadcasts to hundreds of mailboxes. This might be an audience of a couple of people, a small group like your accounts payable group, or it might be targeted at one person like your CEO or CFO. A lot of times, if you're just looking at sort of the baseline and basic sorts of low-hanging fruit, you're not going to catch that. If you're trying to compare that against everybody in the world, instead of really drilling into understanding that specific user. Because we do all this in the cloud using machine learning, we're constantly updating that protection capability for customers. So the authenticating your email side, Rich, if we go ahead and build this out the whole way, Proofpoint's email fraud defense really offers efficacy that's unmatched in the email authentication marketplace. And we really do this through managed services is a big way that we scale. Partnering with professional services consultants, partnering with trusted partners to help that scale. And we really, this is why we hold 4x the scale of our nearest competitor. We hold the largest percentage of Fortune 1000 organizations in the marketplace, and a number of small and mid-sized businesses with our Proofpoint Essentials as well, utilizing our EFD, our email fraud defense. With this number and tenure of consultants, we can really dig deeply and understand the problem. Email fraud defense also gives a unique 360-degree view into the mail flow. So we combine customers' Proofpoint gateways, we combine data across other business gateways and consumer mailbox providers. We're really using all these sources to help do things like enforce DMARC reject without disrupting the flow of email. Email fraud defense is also uniquely integrated with the Proofpoint gateway to make customer defenses against identity deception stronger and smarter. And with this gateway integration, you can really accelerate your DMARC enforcement by creating overrides for legitimate emails that might otherwise fail authentication. So this is one of the problems with rolling out DMARC is a lot of people will get to the point where they're identifying, but really getting to the enforcement side and putting that trust into flipping the switch to actually enforce on DMARC decisions is a big step. Next slide, Rich. So one of the things I mentioned earlier was around this people-centric view of cloud account risk. And we talked about Proofpoint's take on people-centric security in our previous session. So with people-centric visibility, what we're really trying to do here is we're trying to gain visibility into the entire spectrum of cloud account risk and cloud threats out there. Each one of the individual incidents that you might have might not mean a whole lot in isolation, but paired together with some other incidences. So for instance, combining things like failed login attacks or failed login attempts from a highly phished person, along with unauthorized cloud application usage. Let's say that you're standardized on Dropbox and somebody uses Box Enterprise. That might point out some interesting cloud account risk in and of itself. So your top users at risk allow the administrator to see that possible correlation between email and cloud threats. So all of this is about looking at the entire threatscape between email and cloud issues. So things like suspicious logins and failed login attempts might represent cloud-based risky activity, where email threats that are reported on the top dashboard delivered to inbox, things like phishing threats, permitted clicks, represent some of those email-based risky activities. So the single pane of threat intel gives customers really that people-centric view of potential risk in their environment. So to detect those suspicious logins, we combine contextual data like the user device, the location, the login time, and some user behavior analytics. So the anomalies based on things like rarity and prevalence, volume and velocity. And we map that up with our global threat intelligence from not just our targeted attack prevention dashboard, but also our emerging threats intelligence and other data sources we have. So this really helps us detect those truly unusual access attempts and others, such as things like non-human brute force domains. And so even some of the easy stuff gets correlated in here, things like impossible to reach. So somebody trying to log in from California and then 5 seconds later trying to log in from India, and 5 seconds after that, logging in from New York. I mean, obviously, somebody's not in all those locations or resetting their, a VPN that quickly to look like they're from all those locations. All right, next slide. And if we talk about some of the adaptive controls that we have through secure web browsing, email isolation and browser isolation are really the two main use cases here. And the idea is that either through email isolation, which would be isolating access to your personal webmail, through things like, this would be isolating access to Gmail, Yahoo, Hotmail, that kind of thing. But also the tap URL isolation, which can also do things like adaptive controls for those very attacked people. We can do URL embedded rewriting to protect users on any device or network within the email client. And then on the browser side, really looking at ways that we can protect users from web-based threats. And the idea here is that we want to reduce the attack surface and protect users from, not just general non-work browsing kinds of things, but we also want to protect them from a variety of other sorts of browser-induced issues that might happen here. The goal here that we have with some of the adaptive access controls through secure web browsing is, high-risk browsing activities, multiple threat vectors. So I mentioned the case a minute ago about, maybe you've got a savvy user who's got a personal VPN and connecting from a lot of different places, or somebody who's going to high-risk domains and things like that, or just somebody who's clicked on a phishing link and is since been taken over. If we build this out, look at the next slide on accelerating threat detection and response. Because these BEC and EAC attacks ultimately target people, this is why visibility into your human attack surface is so critical. Attackers are shifting really away from attacking infrastructure to attacking people directly. And without having this people-centric visibility, it's hard to provide answers to your board and management about questions like, what's your organization's BEC risk or EAC risk look like? And then, which people are ultimately the most vulnerable. So being able to drill in and getting asked all the time. We talked about on the PeopleCentric Security session last time about identifying, okay, who are my riskiest users and what are they doing? The last point is really, okay, now that I know who some of my riskiest users are, particularly over this number one threat vector of email, what should we do to mitigate the risk? So really what we try to do is provide that people-centric visibility that helps, first of all, identify the most attacked people. So Rich, if we build this out 2 clicks, I think, if we look at, hey, we've got a number of very attacked persons, we might have a specific user that we're really looking into some of their activity. We can help you also not just identify who's being attacked with things like phishing and imposter emails. We can start then cross-correlating that with suspicious cloud account activities like failed logins to cloud services. You'll get visibility into whose cloud email has been compromised, whether that incident's associated with any sort of email threats. So in addition to knowing who's being attacked with BEC phishing, you'll also need to know who's sending emails using your domain. So this might include some of those trusted third-party senders. I think we can build this out one more time and maybe get to that. No, we actually built it too far, but that's okay. I was kind of done with wrapping up. The idea here is that one of the other places that we're going to go to is looking at things like Supplier Risk Explorer to help provide an additional lens of visibility there. Finally, we spent a lot of time, as I would call it, admiring the problem. But what we really want to talk about here is about remediating the problem and cleaning up these business email compromise, email account compromise threats across your organization. This is something that with human intervention and if we just leave it up to us as people and IT security folks and security admins to clean this up, this can be really time consuming. So the longer it takes for you to remediate some of these BEC and EAC threats, the longer your organization is ultimately exposed. So we want to really use automation and automation capabilities to help speed up the remediation here and speed up ultimately that metric you're probably measuring is mean time to remediation, or MTTR. So automating things like your threat detection and response processes, there's a lot of things built into the Proofpoint platform that can help with that automation. First of all, going in and automatically quarantining potential imposter emails is a big part. And that can start with the end users reporting some of those with techniques like the phish alarm button to identify those potential threats. And then the phish alarm analyzer itself can use some smarts to go in and decide, okay, hey, is this a legitimate thing or not? Also, if there's any sort of suspicious cloud account activities like multiple login attempts, security admins can go through and set up sort of workflow-driven task lists to reset things like credentials, re-authenticate users, or even suspend compromised accounts automatically without needing to do all that stuff manually. So with Proofpoint, you can also go in and delete ultimately things like phishing emails that contain URLs that might be poisoned post-delivery. So what that means is you might have a URL that's clean when it hits your email gateway, but 8 hours later, that URL is now live and malicious. So going through and cleaning up some of those things post-delivery and automating some of those functions is certainly going to help accelerate threat response and helping you do a lot less manual work. All right, so next slide here, or next build out. So the other thing I mentioned at the middle of that graphic earlier on in the presentation was around education. So one of the things that you can do is enable your users to be more resilient. So educating your users to identify what does a business email compromise attack look like. We have a BEC module in our security awareness training called Mitigating Compromised Devices, which is similar but not quite the same. Talking about devices, not accounts. But additionally, we have things like password training, why password reuse can lead to account and device compromise. I mentioned earlier the example of, if your credentials have been in a previous breach of, not using those as your email credentials. And data entry phishing modules, we have some content around that. So unlike a lot of our competitors out there, Proofpoint provides training materials, including things like phishing simulations with actual real world examples. So things that look like real domains instead of, using Acme Corp, which, using real world content, real world looking examples are only going to help your employees spot the nuances a lot more easily. I mean, anybody can pick out, okay, Acme Corp's not a real company. But if I have an email that looks like a real legitimate organization that you do business with, or a real legitimate social media site that you access all the time, that's liable to help train your users to look at the next level and dig deeper to spot suspicious emails or suspicious links and things like that. So the other thing Proofpoint also does is streamline that end user reporting and that security response to phishing attacks. So if we build this out to the next slide, really, I mentioned the phish alarm capabilities a minute ago to get users involved. One of the other important things here is it's not just good enough to have a report phishing button or a phish alarm link in your email client. It's also important to give your users feedback and give them, because a lot of times what will happen is if you don't provide that feedback to your users, they'll feel like they're just sending things to the phish alarm into a black hole. And you're not giving them any sort of positive or negative feedback. You're not letting them know, hey, yeah, that indeed was a phishing attack and you saved us, or no, that was actually a training email, but thank you for calling it out, or no, indeed, that was a legitimate email and here's why. So going through, there's some capabilities within the Proofpoint platform that can help you automate some of that feedback loop as well. So if we build this out to the next slide here, Rich. So the takeaway I really want to leave you with is there's no silver bullet. There's no single vendor that's going to help solve the BEC and EAC problem all by themselves. It's really going to take it's going to take that combined, integrated, holistic approach. It's not just go buy a product and solve this. It's go institute a platform to take on BEC, EAC. Go look at all of these other areas like cloud apps and web access and broader visibility, and have a plan for remediation and also educating your users. So if we build this out all the way around here, there's a number of vendors in each of these spaces. Of course, you can see the one vendor that's common across all of these. And really the idea is that Proofpoint is that first and only vendor that's providing that integrated end-to-end solution to address the BEC EHC problem holistically. So we're really trying to tackle this with a solution that's encompassing multiple security controls. So again, not just one product, one solution. It's really looking at security controls and security awareness training to address attacker tactics or attackers' tactics. You can go on and try to solve this $26 billion problem and growing with a whole bunch of different point products that don't talk to each other, don't report the same way. There's no level of visibility. There's no level of automation. There's no feedback into that education loop. And you can do that with 6 vendors or more, or you can really do it with one strategic partner in Proofpoint that can really help you deliver that integrated end-to-end solution.
Brian, I want to thank you again for another great presentation. And folks, if you have questions, go ahead and give us a call at 844-FLYCAST. That's 844-359-2278. And we'll get those answered as quickly as we possibly can for you when you call in, or email them at info@flycastpartners.com. You can also chat with us live Monday through Friday during normal business hours. Now, I have a couple of you during today's presentation that have asked for a recording. Go ahead and email us, or email me at rich.longo@flycastpartners.com. We'll make sure we get you that recording when it's available. I want to thank everyone for taking time out of your very busy day to join us for today's presentation. And until our next event, stay safe out there, folks.